Hello and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're at. Welcome to the Envision IT SharePoint Framework Developer Preview. This is part 2 of a talk that I started about 3 weeks ago. I'm going to start with some introductions here. My name is Peter Carson. I'm the president of Envision IT. We're a Microsoft Gold partner based in Microsoft, Ontario in Canada. I'm also a SharePoint MVP, have been for 6 years running now, and a partner seller with Microsoft Canada. Very much focused on SharePoint and actually quite excited about what Microsoft's doing from a SharePoint framework perspective. We first started hearing about it about a year or so ago, came out with some early announcements back in May publicly, and the previews lit up this summer, so we've been playing around with that. Did a session, as I mentioned, at the beginning of October, sort of as an overview and a reasoning behind the SharePoint framework, and then today's session was in response to feedback from the folks on that session. Can we go a little deeper and understand a bit more of the technical under the hood? So that's really the goal here for today. So in terms of agenda, I actually realized I didn't update the agenda slide as I was getting ready for this, but we're going to start with a very brief overview of Envision IT. We're actually going to skip the development background. So if you haven't attended the previous webinar that I gave and you're looking for some of that background information, the full slide deck and the recording of the session is up and available on our envisionit.com website. And I'll be sharing the links out. We're recording this session, so if you've got colleagues that aren't able to join, would like to be able to come back later to do an on-demand session, certainly they can do that. And then coming back to the agenda, so we're really going to be talking about a couple different alternative app models wrapped around the SharePoint framework, and I'll explain what that means as we get into the session. And really two main focuses there, building client-side code only type solutions and using Visual Studio to build web API projects. And we're going to delve into SharePoint framework on both of those scenarios and talk about that as we go through. We've got questions open. I probably won't have a chance to look at those as we're going through. Amanda will do her best. She's on the call here today as well. If there's specifics she can answer. Otherwise, we'll try and hold a few minutes back at the end to follow up on any of those, or certainly we can follow up after the session itself. All right, so without any further ado, let me just briefly go through the background slides on Envision IT. For those of you that aren't familiar with us, as I mentioned, we're very focused on SharePoint. 3 main areas to that, public-facing websites, intranets or staff portals, and extranets or member portals. And that applies both whether we're talking on-premises SharePoint, Office 365, SharePoint Online, or even SharePoint hosted up in Microsoft Azure. On the extranet side, we actually have an add-on product for SharePoint that works both with on-premise and with the cloud versions of SharePoint called Extranet User Manager. And it's all about delegating and making easy access for users who are external to your organization to come in and either collaborate with you or allow you to securely publish out with them. I'm not going to go into any more detail with that. We've got other webinars specifically on that topic. So let's just dive right into our topic today, which really started about a year ago when I began giving this talk around alternative app models. And it was actually, if I think back prior to last year's MVP Summit when I first started hearing about SharePoint Framework. So as a Microsoft SharePoint MVP, we get the luxury of being invited out to Redmond once a year, meet with the product team. I'm actually going out there the week after next. And it was this time last year that I first heard about the SharePoint Framework. That I'd already been well down the path of kind of formulating in my mind how I wanted to build apps for SharePoint. Because if you attended my previous talk, I took you through the history of full trust solutions to Sandbox to SharePoint apps, and you'd probably get pretty quickly that I'm not a big fan of the SharePoint app model. We wanted something better from that perspective. So what I did when I was preparing those talks, I was put together a checklist of what an ideal app model should look like. And the first one, no iframes, it's a personal thing, but it's a pretty common sentiment as well, that folks just don't like hosting their application inside of an iframe inside the SharePoint window. It should all be native HTML right there in the browser. There's all sorts of issues with iframes around branding and resources being shared between the different applications. Just it's too complex, and from a user experience point of view, it often doesn't work well. You end up having multiple scroll bars on your browser window, and certainly as you get into mobile and responsive, that makes it even further complicated from that point of view. The app model had these weird wildcard domains that you needed to set up that the apps ran in. Again, part of my reason for moving away from the SharePoint app model was to reduce complexity. I wanted something simple. No code on the SharePoint server. Yes, if you run your own on-premises SharePoint farm, there's nothing stopping you continuing to deploy full trust solutions. But the writing's on the wall. I mean, the cost to run your on-premises environments is significantly higher than what it costs to run at massive scale in Office 365 and SharePoint Online. So we're seeing more and more of our clients making that move across. In fact, we're based in Canada. The Canadian data centers opened earlier this year. That was kind of the last big roadblock for a lot of our Canadian clients from a data residency point of view. And we're seeing a groundswell of movement towards SharePoint Online. So anything that we do, even if we're building it for on-premises, we recognize that, yes, maybe it is on-premises today, but next year, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, well within the lifespan of that application that we're building, that may be moving to Office 365. So we want to have a single approach, a single way of doing that, whether that is on-premise or Office 365. Now, today, the SharePoint Framework we're going to talk more about is just in preview in Office 365. And what that means is you have to have a developer tenant in Office 365 with early release or first release turned on, and you can leverage the SharePoint Framework feature. So it's not something that's ready for production use yet on Office 365, never mind from an on-premises point of view. And the story that came out from Jeff Teeper at Ignite last month down in Atlanta, he runs the engineering team for SharePoint, was we're going to get it right, we're going to get it finished on the cloud first, which is consistent with Microsoft's approach these days. Everything is cloud first, it's built for the cloud, and then it comes on premises. So it's not going to be showing up on SharePoint 2016 until it's fully general availability, and the kinks are all worked out from a cloud point of view. So what does that mean? Is that sometime in 2017? I imagine so, but probably not the beginning of. So don't quote me on that. There was no dates given out at Ignite. So first and foremost, it is a cloud platform. Having said that, though, a lot of the approaches that I'm going to be sharing today are things that we were doing prior to there even being a SharePoint framework. And some of what I'm going to show you is how we've migrated those apps into the SharePoint framework without a whole lot of rework on them. So if you take this client-side development model and run with it, even if you don't have the framework yet, it's along that same concept, and you can actually really leverage that as the framework comes along from there. So coming back to the checklist, great user experience. That's part of the big reason I don't like iframes, but at the end of the day, mobile first is so important. Building responsive sites, whether they're public-facing or internal staff portals, it's equally important today. Bring your own device is very common, and we want to have a great user experience from that point of view. A standard development model. If we think back to the world of SharePoint developers, as you went sort of back to SharePoint 2007, there was a huge growth in the product. There was a lack of technical resources that really understood it. There was really a challenge to find people that knew how to do SharePoint development. And one of the big goals with Framework is to say, well, let's just use standard web stack. So you don't need to be a SharePoint expert in order to develop for Framework. And we'll talk more about that as we get in as well. The next one's a key one, though. A lot of the framework demonstrations that I've seen have been very focused on client-side code only, and that fits some scenarios, but not all. There's places where you do need to run with elevated permissions. That the person who's logged into the browser maybe doesn't have the rights in SharePoint to do what they need to do. And we don't want to give them those rights for security reasons, for complexity reasons. We don't want to get into item level permissions, things like that. It's better to have some code running on the server that does those sort of business rules or security rules from that point of view. So we want to make sure that the model supports that. And ultimately, not just integrating with SharePoint, but with other line of business applications as well. And the last one's actually a new addition that I just put on. As I've been playing with the framework and the client-side model and web APIs, I've realized this ability to do all of your development end-to-end locally on your workstation and not have a SharePoint VM and not be connected to SharePoint or Office 365 is very productive. It's a rapid way to go through the development cycle, and I'm going to show you some live demos that illustrate that point. Okay, so these are a couple of slides that I grabbed from the quite a number of SharePoint Framework talks that happened down at Ignite. And all the talks and all the decks are available. I've got links at the end of the slide deck. They'll all be there when you pull the deck down. So if you want to get deeper into what was talked about in Atlanta and you weren't able to attend Ignite, I encourage you to have a look at those and dive down into that. So the first thing was, really answering the question from being posed to engineering, why do we need SharePoint Framework? We've had 3 different iterations of ways to develop things for SharePoint, and now you're telling us there's a 4th way we're supposed to do it. How long is that going to last for, and should we invest in it, or is it going to be gone in a couple of years again? Really, the answer was that telemetry is hugely important in Office 365. Microsoft looks at what everybody's doing and they roll that information up to understand how they're leveraging not just SharePoint but the whole Office 365 stack. So when they look specifically at what developers were doing in SharePoint, they found that 2 web parts in particular were orders of magnitude more commonly used than everything else in SharePoint, and that was the content editor and the script editor web part. And what that was telling them was that people were doing their own custom development client-side using jQuery, JavaScript, HTML, open source libraries, and just dropping that HTML into a content editor web part or a script editor web part to render on the SharePoint pages. And they may be calling back to SharePoint to do that, and I'm going to show you some examples of what we've done along those lines in on-premises SharePoint today. But that was happening extensively in Office 365 as well. And they said, well, that's cool, people are doing interesting things that way, but there's not really a framework around that or a structure around that. So how do we make that better for developers? And one of the other key things was it wasn't just from the perspective of third-party developers, all of us who don't work for Microsoft and are building our own customizations, but also from a first-party developer as well. Microsoft has been investing heavily in refreshing the UI around SharePoint Online, and they needed tooling in order to do that. Responsive is expected, iframes are not popular, and ultimately the SharePoint framework was built to address those concerns, not only for us outside of Microsoft, but also the engineering teams inside of Microsoft. And that's an important point because the folks in engineering that are using it to actually build SharePoint itself are going to be some of the harshest critics and the shortest path back to the SharePoint framework team to say, hey, this isn't working, you need to fix this. So, at the end of the day, it's all about leveraging open source tools, and we're going to go into some of those details. Now, today, SharePoint Framework is just focused on custom web parts. Longer term, we're going to talk about branding of custom portals and building custom intranet portals. Those features aren't available yet in the SharePoint Framework, but we know that's part of the roadmap coming from Microsoft. I'm going to skim through this area pretty quickly. I covered it in more detail in my previous session. It's basically a catalog of all the various different open source tools that are used as part of the SharePoint framework. A lot of the ones on this page here are for getting the base project up and going. We're not going to be focused on that today. I did that process as part of the previous webinar. What we are going to be doing is going more into the TypeScript side of things and the actual code that you write inside of your SharePoint framework project. In addition to that, we're going to be leveraging jQuery and Handlebars, 2 other open source frameworks that we've made part of many of our solutions. And then lastly, we're going to be talking more about Visual Studio and Swagger for building web APIs, where you want to have some code that runs on the backend server and hook that up into your SharePoint framework. Okay, so quickly to go over the process of building SharePoint Framework web parts. Starting up on the top left corner, you install the SharePoint generator and use a tool called UMN to generate all the code related to the base classes that you need to start your Hello World or whatever web part you're actually building through there. You then use Visual Studio Code to edit. Gulp compiles that, and it ships it to your local SharePoint workbench. So when I said before, being able to do that development locally is tremendously valuable, and I'll show you how quickly those turns can be through there. Ultimately, use Gulp to package and deploy that to SharePoint. You can test it up on your SharePoint site, deploy everything out to a content delivery network, and then actually run it up in SharePoint from there. So these are a couple of the links, again, that I went through on the previous session from there. So what we're going to do now is start to dive into the technical side of things. And we're going to begin with the scenario where we're just running client-side code only. Now, there's a couple of scenarios where we want to do this. Maybe we want to present some read-only data. So there's no real business rules other than security around that. Things like catalog publishings or visualizations, any sort of customized user experience makes a lot of sense from that. Also some simple forms that just write directly back into SharePoint lists and libraries. And again, the thing to remember here is that the person using those forms needs the appropriate rights in SharePoint. They could go directly to those lists to do things, but the form is a more convenient, more user-friendly way perhaps for them to interact with that. We're not going to get just yet into the scenarios where we're going to lock down some of the permissions on that. So how do we actually talk back to SharePoint? Well, there's a couple different ways. There's a client-side object model, and there's .NET and JavaScript libraries for that. And there's also REST APIs that you can call directly. And REST seems to be where Microsoft's making most of the investment. They've actually been doing a lot of work around building what they call the Office Graph API that's rolling up not just the SharePoint APIs, but Azure AD, Exchange, all the different product APIs into one unified API that can be used by developers in a very similar way, regardless of which product you're talking to from there. So REST seems to be the direction that they're focusing in from. So the first scenario that we're going to use, and we're going to spend most of the time on, is actually around our cross-site publishing. So let me pull up our browser here, and I just want to show you a couple different sites to give you a sense of what this means. So if you've registered for this event, which I'm assuming you have, you're on the webinar now, you've gone to either our Envision IT or our Extranet user manager site. So we actually run two separate brands. I mentioned we have a separate product. We call it EUM for short. Actually, you can type that in the browser, eum.co, to bring that site up. Now, both of the sites are built on SharePoint 2013 currently, and they both have a current events section. What we're using is the catalog features in SharePoint 2013 to roll that content up on both of the sites. We don't actually have to author it on both sites. We just author it on one common site between the two of them. So when I come into the events and news here, I actually see all the same events. So if I look at today's event that we have for the framework, and I'm on the EUM site, I click on the link there, it actually flips me over to the Envision IT site. Likewise, if I was on an event here, like a previous one that we had around our Extranet User Manager 2 weeks ago or so, that would flip me over to the Extranet User Manager site. So they're very intertwined and interrelated. One of the goals, though, is to present these events on our staff portal as well, which happens to be Office 365. So how do we wire that up and have it do the same sort of cross-site publishing features through here? So let me take you through what that actually looks like. So I'm going to start with the finished product, and then I'm going to pull the pieces back and kind of explain how that all wires together. So what I've done is I've built a SharePoint Framework web part for news and events, and it's wired in through the REST search calls directly into our live public-facing websites, because those REST endpoints are anonymously available. We'll talk about cores and cross-site queries in a minute, but suffice to say that's how it's wired together. So let me actually come back to my browser here, and on my first page here, actually, you know what I'm going to do is just discard that. So I'm going to start with the local workstation version of what's called the SharePoint Workbench. So this is actually just an HTML file. It may look like Office 365, but when I click on the app launcher or my people icon, nothing actually happens because I'm not actually running in SharePoint. But this is actually a nice way to do my development. So I'll show you the end result, and then I'll pull back through there. So when I'm doing modern page editing, which is what the workbench is showing me here, I can click on my ad. Now there's not a lot of web parts here because I'm not actually running in SharePoint. It's just seeing the local web part that I've developed on my local system. So I click on that, and I initially just see some sample content because I haven't configured the web part. So I click on the pencil to configure, and I get a web part configuration panel that comes up. And I've customized the look of this, so I can say, okay, what sort of items do we want to show in this particular list? Well, I'm interested in events that are targeted to the Envision IT website. And let's say we want to see 5 events, and right now it's showing me past by default. Let's actually switch that to future. So you can see live as I'm playing with the configuration here, the web part is actually updating. And behind the scenes, what it's doing an AJAX jQuery call to the search APIs on our public sites to say, give me the events according to the criteria that are targeted at this site. I need this many, and I need the past one. So you can see it's giving me the most recent previous, and then going back in time from there. You know, I could bump that up and say, okay, let's have 25 in there. Now I get a much longer list of events through there. And you can see it's extremely responsive. You know, that REST search call is very quick to happen. As I change things in here, boom, it's doing the REST call. It's coming back, it's formatting the HTML from there. So it's not doing a whole page turn, and that's part of the idea of having a very responsive site. And I don't mean from a mobile point of view, I mean from a page load and interactivity perspective. So let's actually come back to our Envision IT site for a minute here. And what I've done is we have a debugging feature that I've turned on our site so that as we're building this cross-site publishing, we can see those REST queries that are happening underneath the hood. So if I click on the debug link that's on here now, it'll come to this REST search page, and it'll show me the query that's being executed to bring up that list of events that we're seeing there. So I can actually take this query here, and I can paste it into my browser, and I can get a big long piece of XML back of all the data. And further down in here you'll see, here's our actual session here today, and the date for it, and the title, and all the details around there. It's not particularly well formatted for an end user to see it. It's just the XML data. So we have to translate this and turn it into the proper formed data. One of the other things that we can do here is I can actually execute that query client-side here. This is not SharePoint Framework. This is still what we've built in SharePoint 2013. So these are actually content editor web parts that we've dropped on the page that's providing this functionality. But effectively, they're doing the same thing that we're going to want to do in Framework. They've got some client-side HTML and some jQuery that wires that together and talks to back-end APIs. So you can see here, it took 78 milliseconds, so it's pretty quick to execute that query to come back with the 5 upcoming events that we have here. And we just use a Telerik Kendo grid to make it a little easier to see the results there and be able to look through what's coming back from that. So what we wanted to do was take that and bake that into SharePoint Framework. So let's actually work through what that actually looks like. So I'm going to start by opening up my Visual Studio Code, not really project. So if you haven't worked with Visual Studio Code, it's the free open source version of Visual Studio. It's pretty lightweight. I mean, the idea is that there's no solution files, there's no compiling. It's basically an editor for a bunch of files that you have on your disk. So when you open it up, you basically open a folder. You go to a particular folder that you've got your project in, select it, and you see in the navigation pane here all the files related to your project. Now, one of the things that kind of shocked me when I first started working with SharePoint Framework was just the size and number of files in there. So if I actually come to that folder where this particular project is running, so I've got it deep down in here. Sorry, no, I'm up here. Cross-site web part. There we go. Okay, so this is the project file that was generated by human and then the customizations against that. If I just do an Alt-Enter on that to bring up the properties for that, it's going to take a little while. I can come back to it later, but you can see, it contains 66,000 files and 388 meg. So the source footprint is actually huge. The good news is you don't need to check 66,000 files into your TFS. There's only actually a very small set of files that are your actual source code that you need to put under source control. So if we drill into that and have a look, there's an aptly named folder called SRC that has the source in it. That has 9 files and is 11.5K in size, so that's much more manageable. There is a little bit in the config folder as well. Everything else, you could basically regenerate your project and then drop this code in on top of it again. You don't really need to keep the rest of it in source control from that point of view. So let's come back to Visual Studio Code and have a look through some of the different elements that are in there and how that wires together. So I'm in the big main TypeScript file right now, and I have to admit, I'm not a TypeScript person yet. I'm just getting my head around it. So you're actually going to see much of the code in here is actually just plain old JavaScript. And TypeScript doesn't mind that. It lets you drop JavaScript in there. It doesn't really let you leverage the full benefits of TypeScript in the sense that you can do inheritances and classes and things that you'd be more familiar with as a C# developer, and then ultimately that gets compiled into JavaScript. But even if you're doing just pure plain JavaScript inside your TypeScript, you still get a lot of advantages. You get all the compile time checking. So if you've misnamed variables, you've got syntax errors, you've forgotten a semicolon, you don't have to wait until you run your code, and maybe you don't even exercise that particular line of code that has an error on it till sometime later. It all gets checked at compile time. So it won't let you proceed if you've got something wrong in there. In fact, if I come in and just say, okay, well, let's take a semicolon out of here and hit save, in the background, let me pull up another window here. This is actually the gulp window, and basically what gulp is doing is it's sitting there and checking and seeing if there's any files changed in there, and what does it need to update from there. Actually, that probably wasn't a good example. Let me do something more obvious from an error point of view. So I know I used that EIT site variable. So you can see live right there, the IntelliSense is highlighted that and say, okay, I can't find that variable name. If I ignore it and try and compile it, I actually get a build script error coming up. You didn't see it because it popped up on my other window, but I can come back here and say, okay, in this particular TypeScript file, cannot find that name. So I can come back to that, fix that, save again, and you can see in the background it's gone ahead and updated that. And the other thing that we'll do, let me actually share the windows here for a second. So if I put this window here, bring up my browser over here, and I come back to my SharePoint Workbench, if I hit Control-S here to save my file, it recognizes that I've changed that, Gulp has recompiled it, and it's refreshed my browser window over here. So, I mean, if we do a count out, 1 Steamboat, 2 Steamboat, 3 Steamboat, boom, in 3 seconds, I've saved my changes, and I now see the results of those changes. I haven't actually done any changes, but you get a sense that it can be very quick back and forth through there to update your project. And that's the real beauty of being able to do the development locally on your system. You're not deploying stuff up into a SharePoint app catalog and maybe having a 15-minute turn cycle to go through and try something out and realize that you missed one thing and now you've got to do it again. That's not a productive way of working. This is a much, much more productive way as a developer to work. So I'm a huge fan from that point of view. Okay, so let's take us through a bit more of a tour of the code itself. So as I mentioned, right now I'm in the main webparts.ts, so that stands for TypeScript file that's driving the operation of it. And if we start at the top here, I've got a couple of references. So I pulled in jQuery, Handlebars, and Moment, which are 3 common open source libraries. jQuery, I'm sure everybody knows. Handlebars is a templating engine, so you give it a bunch of data like what we get back from the search and an HTML template, and it'll mash those together and give us the nicely formatted HTML that we see on the page. Moment is a date formatting library. We're going to want to format the dates that come back from search with friendly full text dates on there. So those 3 are doing those things through there. Now as we come down into our code, we see this public render method in the middle of the page here. This is basically where the main meat of the work is happening. Basically, with the code that you write in here, it's going to generate the HTML that's going to get spit out onto the page. And then if we come down to the bottom of the code, so I'm going to go through more detail in this code later on, and we also see the property pane settings. So you remember when I put the modern web part onto the workbench, I had a number of configuration panels that I could set for that. These are all defined through here. So I've got what type of item is it? Is it an event or a news article? Which site are we targeting to draw content from? How many items do I want? And do I want future or past items through there? So this is just defining the interface that I can choose from. And then in the main code as it's rendering the web part, it actually takes those decisions and actually runs through that code. Okay. So let's start up at the top. So when we first come into this code, basically what it's going to do is build up a search URL. And if we start right here, there's a base part of the search query which is constant. It doesn't change, and we just hand-coded it in there. But then we've got choices from the properties, and this is where you see the power of TypeScript starting to come out. Like, what site do we want the content targeted for in order to show up in this web part? Well, you remember I showed you at the bottom that there was the property panel. This is where we see the object-oriented side of TypeScript start to come through. So basically, I'm diving into the local object, this, and going into its properties and into its target site to get that out. Now, I'm not doing any error checking on here, but it is a pick list, so I know that people are going to only be able to choose a valid option from there. And then I continue that process there. I say, okay, with the item date is set to future, then we want to build the query to say, well, get stuff that's today or in the future and sort them in ascending order. So we start with the next most recent one, and then we go forward in time from there. But in the else case, which means I'm asking for past events, we'll flip that filter around. I only want stuff from before today, and now I want the sortation to be in descending order. And then the last property was, how many items do I want to have coming back? You remember I put a 5 in there and then a 50. I saw a different number of events coming back through there. Just set that row limit to whatever has been entered for the item count through there. So a little bit of TypeScript. I'm able to take the property pane panel values, form my query that I'm going to be putting in against SharePoint, and then I do an AJAX call out to say, okay, let's execute that particular get method. So then what comes back from that? Well, if we look at the success method here, it gets back this big JSON data block. That's what we saw when we pasted that query into the browser. We got all the data back from that. And I want to drill down into the actual results table that's inside that query. There's lots of other cool information, how long did the query take to run, things like that. But for my purposes, I just want the raw data down in the guts of that, and I'm going to be able to then format that. So what I do is I spin through each of those results that come back, and I basically build up an array of key value pairs that match with what came back from that table, because the table itself is not in a format that handlebars, which is what I'm going to use in a minute to format the results, can consume. So I need to kind of reformat that. There's a few tweaks I need to do, like the image tags that come back from the search query actually have image HTML tags around them, and I don't want that. I just want the source URL itself. So I do a bunch of string manipulation to figure that out. But the reality is that all of this code that I've got here is actually the exact same jQuery code. If you do a view source or an F12 on our public site, you're going to see this same JavaScript code on our current site. So we're able to take that code that we'd already built for 2013 and just lift it right into the SharePoint Framework project. So if you've been doing this model already, or you're in a position where you can't leverage SharePoint Framework yet, maybe you're working on-premise, you can still take this style of development and work with it, and it makes that migration to Framework much easier from that point of view. So ultimately, I'm building up this results object, and I'm going to call into handlebars. So handlebars takes a template, and for now I've actually just baked it right into the code here. So here's the HTML that it's going to spin through to create the rendered HTML. And the way that handlebars works, you see these double brace brackets here. Everything within that tag is going to get repeated for each row of results that comes back. And then there's replacements that happen inside of that. So things like the event date, basically it's filled in with the date through there. Now we use Moment to do some formatting of that before we pass it over to handlebars, but that again is all exactly the same as what we're doing on the current site. And at the end of the whole process, ultimately what we're doing is basically just taking the HTML that comes out of handlebars and overwriting a div tag in the top content that's being written out. We could actually optimize it a little further to make this more SharePoint Framework-ish, where it just goes back into the render output. But I wanted to lift and keep the code as consistent as possible, just from a POC point of view. If something goes wrong, I don't get any events back. That's where I get this. There are currently no recent events, which is what we see when we first add the web part to our page, because there's nothing configured on it for it to pull items back from there. So that's basically it. That's the client-side code that's running all this. So there's actually not a lot of code in here, and it's very easy to configure and tweak it from there. In fact, if I wanted a different layout, I can come into the template here and just readjust that HTML, and away I go from there, and I've got my new data. So let's actually try a quick little test here. If I just put some plain text, standard hello world right in there. I actually haven't tried this before, so we'll see if I blow my things up or it works properly for me. There we go. We get our hello world coming in through there. So you can see it's very easy to modify. In fact, what I had intended to do was actually put that inside of the this tag, and we'll actually see that repeat down through each item in there. So now, because it's inside, you see it here, we see it here again through each of those items. So you can see how that template works. So we've got some outer Chrome, and then we've got the inner item level details through there. Let's just put that back for now then. And we come back here, we'll see that refresh. Boom, we're back to where we were. So very quick turns there to do some adjustments and playing around from there. And I don't have any other supporting JavaScript files. Everything's in this TypeScript file here. Other than the open source libraries like jQuery, Handlebars, and Moment that I'm pulling in, this one file is basically it. That's my whole project. And there's nothing I built on the SharePoint side. It's using out-of-the-box REST APIs in order to do its work from there. Now remember, I'm still working in my local host. So I've spun up an IIS site, or actually, sorry, it's a Node.js site. Got to get used to the open source terminology here, running on my local PC. So it's not actually in SharePoint at all at this point now. So let's talk about how we then push that up into the SharePoint app catalog, and what do we do with that. So the first thing I need to do is actually create a package. So if we look at my file structure here, I've already run these commands, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to update the slide deck. I didn't get a chance to get all my notes in there and up to date before this session. There was some last minute figuring out going on, but basically you run a node command to say I want to package this for distribution, and we'll see in our library here we've got a SharePoint folder with a solution, and there's this .spapp file here. That's the packaged up solution ready to be deployed to SharePoint. Now it doesn't have all the bits and pieces in there, so all the handlebars and Moment and jQuery and those assets that I'm using are not part of this package. So I need to figure out how to distribute those a different way. Typically what we do is we make that part of the master page or the alternate CSS for the site that we're doing. So we do it as part of the customizations of the site. So I'll show you in a minute on the SharePoint Framework side how we've wired that together. So I basically take this .spapp and I load it up into my app catalog. So let's actually go over to that page. So this is an app catalog that I've created on my Envision IT pcarson.sharepoint.com. That's my Office 365 developer tenant that I'm using for this this talk that we're doing right now. So I've uploaded the .spapp file into here, and it basically deploys it out. So it marks it as yes here. The next thing that I do is I go to the site where I want to use this particular app. So if I come over here and I come to my site contents, I'm not going to add the app again because I've already got it in there, but you'll see here's my EIT cross-site pub web part client-side project here loaded up in my local app. I mean, what I did to do that was I said add an app. I come in here and I'll actually see, I don't see it now because I've already added it, but I would see it in my list of apps I can add based on having uploaded it in the app catalog. Now, one thing to remember is at this point in the development process, everything's still wired back to my local host. So the app code is still running off my node local environment. And I actually made a mistake when I was doing this before. I shut down my my gulp process that was running here, and then I couldn't figure out why I couldn't add the app was because it actually wasn't running locally anymore from there. So you've got to keep the developer image up and running and going. Obviously, that's not how you deploy your apps longer term, but as you're doing your development, you can continue the journey that I started previously, where you can make changes in your Visual Studio code. Gulp will see those changes, and instead of seeing the results on your local SharePoint workbench, you can actually see them on the app pages themselves. So let's actually go to one of those pages that I've set up. So if I come back to my site contents, and to start with, I've done it just on a classic page. The reason I did that was because I mentioned before, I've actually included the references for jQuery and handlebars and such into the master page for this. So I just took the out-of-the-box Seattle, added those couple of references in, and away we went from there. So I've created a page called Cross-Site Publishing that I can bring up here, and we can see I've actually dropped that SharePoint Framework part in here. Now the editing experience on the classic side is still a little bit wonky, so if I come in here and say I want to edit this page, we're going to see some overlays on top of each other here. So the web part here, because we're not on a modern page experience, I don't get the immediate just bring up the properties pane for it. I have to go to the traditional drop down over here to say I want to edit the web part, and I'll get the classic style web part pane here, and then I have to click on configure. The weird thing is that my panels coming up in behind there makes it a little tough to interact with that. But we can have a look at that and see, okay, if I change this from, oh, actually that pulls it out a bit, from future to past, I mean, I still get that live interaction even on a classic experience, that it's re-executing that query and showing the results up from there. So I've used the modern SharePoint Framework design model, but I've created a web part that I can drop onto a classic page. I can also drop it onto a modern page, but because that page doesn't have the references I need right now, that's going to be broken. I could include those references into the web part itself. I'd prefer not to do that. We may have multiple instances of web parts on a single page, and I don't want 3 or 4 or 5 references to handlebars and jQuery and all those different things because I've got 3 or 5 web parts on there. I'd rather do it once in the master page through there. And right now we can't customize that on the modern pages just yet. So there's still some work happening around that whole experience and where that's going. But that gives you a sense, though, how easy it was to create a web part, leveraging a lot of the work that we'd already done on SharePoint 2013, bake it into SharePoint Framework, and then deploy it up into our Office 365 tenant and get it working from there. I'm going to flip gears. I want to be cognizant of time. I haven't actually done a trial run through this. This is my first pass through. So there's a couple of other slides in here. I'm going to refer you back to previous talk as I get into more details around some of the forms that we built. These are client-side only code talking to SharePoint lists, and jump over to this conversation around running with elevated permissions. I mentioned this previously. There's times where there's things that you want to do that the user doesn't directly have rights to do in SharePoint. You know, maybe they don't have read or edit rights in the lists. You want to do column level security, some custom business rules, and it would get too complex to try and do that all through out-of-the-box item level security in SharePoint. So it's better to put a wrapper in front of that, and the best way to do that is to build a Visual Studio Web API. Because you can't run it in JavaScript, you can't put it on the SharePoint server, we need somewhere else to do that. So Web API projects, they're part of ASP.NET 4.5, and you got the full .NET stack. You know, you're typically going to use C# to build that. You can deploy it on premises, or you can put it up in Azure. In some scenarios, you can cheat deploy it if it's an on-premise SharePoint right into the SharePoint web front ends. But I'm going to talk today about the authentication side of it and how that process works, because that's really the tricky part around this. You know, anonymous is easy. I'll show you some quick examples. I covered in more detail in the last session. But it's really the bottom scenario where we want to leverage Azure Active Directory to do this. I mean, this is the scenario where you're running your client-side code in Office 365, and you want to call the app, but you want to make sure that the app knows who's calling it, that authentication comes through seamlessly to it from there. And Azure AD is the glue that fits that together. Because every time you log into Office 365, under the hood, what you're doing is actually logging into Azure AD. And AD can be be used to authenticate the web APIs as well from that. So I'm going to skip past the anonymous scenarios. These are some simple anonymous forms that we've built for a couple different sites that allow you to submit back into SharePoint. And I want to take you through how you actually create a new web API project and what this looks like. There's a lot of ways to do this. Do I have the right way? I'm not sure. I found, I don't know how many paths through we took to try and find the secret sauce that wires it all together. And I'm going to kind of blast you through that. If I have time, what I'd like to do is maybe do a follow-on recording after this session to dive a little deeper specifically into this. So let's start again at the top side and then step back from there. So if we think about when we're deploying stuff out into Office 365 and into Azure from a web API point of view, how does that wire together? So on the left-hand side, we've got our Office 365 tenant. As we mentioned, it's being authenticated through Azure AD, and there's some client-side code running in SharePoint Framework that wants to talk to a web API. Where is that web API? It could be on-premises, but for arguments here, we're going to say we're going to deploy that up into a web app in Azure, which is a very cheap, cost-effective way of having a highly available, fault-tolerant hosting platform for your web APIs. Now, it may be in the same tenant as your Office 365, or it could be in a different tenant. In the example that we're doing here today, I'm actually building it and deploying it to a different tenant than the free tenant that comes with my Carson Azure AD for my Office 365. And there's another little piece. You actually need a SQL database as part of this, so we're going to use a hosted Azure SQL database to bring that up that contains some of the authentication logic that's needed to wire this all together. And that was a key piece. That when you go through the Visual Studio Wizard, it doesn't tell you yes or no that you need that. The problem is if you don't do it, things just don't work from there. So that was a lot of the trial and error experimenting, a number of different blog articles that I'll provide links on that helped me through that, as well as our own team, Mauricio and Dinesh, spent a lot of time trying to figure this out and working through different scenarios on that. So kudos to them for laying all the groundwork to get me here. Okay, so let's have a look at the finished application first, and then we'll go through the process of actually creating that. So what I've got here is actually two Visual Studio projects. So I mentioned before I like to be able to do all the development locally. So I'm going to have a web API project, and I'm also going to have a web form that exercises that API, all as part of the project. And basically I can run that locally. I can authenticate both of them through Azure AD, and the sample web form project that I have down at the bottom here can actually emulate being Office 365 in the sense that the authentication is all going to come through from that point of view. And it's a pretty simple application. I wanted to keep it as base as possible, and all I wanted to do was to be able to display the username of the user who's logged into Office 365 through that client-side call to the web API. For that to succeed, it means that both sides need to be authenticated and they need to trust each other to allow that call to go through. So I've got a web API called v1/username that allows somebody to call that and get back the current username. Let me actually just run this first. So if I fire it up and run it, it's set to default to my client-side app first. And because I haven't logged in yet, I've launched a brand new browser here. It's going to bring up the Azure AD login form. So I pick the account here, which is associated with this particular tenant. So pcarson at Envision IT, pcarson.onmicrosoft.com, long name there. Put in my password, and imagine that I'm logging into Office 365, and I'll show you later what that looks like as well. So I've come into the top-level application, which is just the default ASP.NET that you get building the project. But I can see here it says hello pcarson. I know that I'm authenticated at that point. Now let's bring up another URL here for a second. I'm just going to copy that from my notes. And I'm going to hit the web API, which is also hosted on my local host here. So it's a different port number, and it didn't go through the login form because my browser session is already authenticated to Azure AD. There actually was a login that happened there. It just went by really quickly and said, oh, I know who you are. You're pcarson again. So once I've got that, what I can do is I can actually go down to Swagger, and I'll talk more about this, but this is how you document your web APIs. It's an open source framework that you add to your web API projects, And I can see here's my API with my one method called username. It's a get. There's that v1 username that we saw. And I can actually try that out right here. So not only does it document my application for me, it gives me a test bench to actually try that out. And not just gets, I can do posts and deletes and updates through there as well. So it's very flexible from that point of view. And I can see I got a 200 back, which means green light, everything's good from the web API call. And the response body is what I was looking for there. In fact, I can come back to my web API project. Let's actually come into the actual controller for that. So this username controller, again, there's not a lot of code involved here. Here's that API method that we had, and basically it says get the identity name of the current user, and if it's empty, return anonymous because they haven't authenticated, which you actually can't get to that scenario now anymore. Otherwise, return their name back. So I could actually set an F9 breakpoint there and step through that code, which is very useful from a development point of view. Obviously, there's only 1 or 2 lines of code here, but as you get more complex API code, being able to walk through that in an F5 session through Visual Studio is very productive as a developer. You don't want to have to start putting logging statements in there and recompiling your code. You want to live be able to just walk through that and see how that happens. And if we look at the other code, actually let me pull up the end user side of that. So if I come to my default.html, there's just an HTML page that's doing a jQuery call to get that name back. So let's have a look at what that looks like here. So if I come to my default.html page, you can see here it's got a div with an ID on it and some sample content, and that sample content is getting overwritten with the return call from the API. That's all being done by some jQuery code. Again, not a lot of code. So a jQuery style AJAX call to that same v1 username API that we saw, do a get against it. Now we'll talk in a minute about cross domain. We are crossing between 2 different domains here, so we have to set up what's called cores to get that to work properly. And if that's successful, then take that content area text and just overwrite it with the data that came back from that call. So it's very simple, and that's the net result that we see coming out from that. So how do we build that? How does that all hang together? Well, what I'm going to do is fire up another Visual Studio project here and just walk you through some of that process. We're not going to have a chance to build and run the whole thing, but I should have enough time to give you a quick sense of what that looks like. So let's start by building a new project here. We'll just leave it as Web Application 1, and we'll leave it as an ASP.NET Web Application. So I'll say OK. Now this is the important part here. You know, when I was first working with this, I was choosing Web API. But when I came into my change authentication, we'll talk more about here, I wasn't able to manipulate that properly and get the authentication working properly. What I ended up finding worked better was to create an MVC style project and then check the Web API off of that. Now this authentication piece is important. What we need to do here is switch this to work and school accounts. And what this means is it's going to authenticate against Azure AD. It takes a second here. It's going out through my Azure subscription and saying, well, what tenants, what domains do you have available to you there? I got a whole bunch on my tenant, but it's that Envision IT Carson one is the one that I logged in with that we want to work with there. Now, I don't need to actually access any directory data. I just want to know who the authenticated user is, so I'm going to leave that checkbox off. I hit OK here. Now, I've left this checkbox saying I want to host it in the cloud because I'm going to put it up in an app service. So I say OK. And now it takes me through the Azure pages, and it actually does a lot of work for me to build this out in Azure for me. So it's created a web application name, needs to be a unique name. I'll leave it with what it's got there. Which subscription, again, I have a bunch of subscriptions on my account. And what resource group. I've got an EIT dev that I'm keeping all my samples in here. And my service plan, I actually have since I'm in Canada, a Canada Central service plan. Now, the important step that you kind of miss if you don't look too closely here is I need to come into services and add a SQL database. Even if I don't want SQL for my application, it's necessary for the authentication to work properly. So I've already set up a SQL server that has a bunch of databases on there, so I can actually use that, or I can create a new one through here. I just need to know the password that I set when I created that SQL server up in the cloud. So it's not I'm not responsible for running that whole SQL database. It's a platform as a service SQL through there. I can leave the rest as it stands, hit OK. So now I've got my web application SQL database there, and now I can go ahead and create that. So it's creating the project, and then it's going to reach out into Azure and actually provision the SQL database, the web app, and it's going to register this application in Azure AD. So Azure AD trusts this and recognizes this so that later on we can use it and call it from our Office 365 side of things. Okay, so we've got our application up. Why don't I cross my fingers and see what happens here. So if I run this, just like we saw in my other application, the first thing that I should see is the Azure AD authentication come up for me. So I'm hitting a different local host there, and boom, it's doing what I expected. It wants me to log in. So that authentication is working properly. I know that step of my project is hanging together properly. I actually haven't built a web API yet here. This is just an empty MVC project. It's got a couple of controllers in there to support that, but what I want to do is actually add a new controller to this. And there's a couple of ways I can go here. I can say, well, let me add an empty controller, or actually want a base controller that's got some read-write actions on it. So I can go ahead and add that. I'll just call it my webinar controller. So that'll scaffold that up for me. And now I have a bunch of sample methods in here. And this is good from demonstration purposes, just to see how that works. Now I mentioned Swagger and Swashbuckler to provide the documentation for that. How do I do that? Well, I come over to my tools in NuGet, which is how we manage all of our open source components, and I can browse through my packages here. So I can see what's installed already, but I want to browse to what's available. I just type in Swagger, and the first item that comes up is actually called Swashbuckle, and it's basically the component you put into a .NET project to provide the framework for Swagger. So I say I want to put that into Web Application 1, go ahead and install it, say OK, and it's going to pull that open source code down from NuGet, put it into my project, and wire it up from there. And that's really all that I need to do. So now if I run that same project, I'm going to have to authenticate again. So let me sign in here. Now this part here I haven't quite worked all the way through here. You have to accept the application to give it permission to sign you in. We need to figure out how to have that happen automatically so each user doesn't see that through there. So there's still a couple of rough edges I'm working through, but I've got my app, I'm signed in, and what I can do up here is just add Swagger to the URL. This whole Swagger UI, you saw all I did was add the NuGet package, and I've got my webinar method, and there's all those sample methods in there. I can pick the get one, try it out, and I get my value 1, value 2. That's actually the code that we saw over here, this value 1, value 2 that's coming back from here. It's not actually doing anything, it's just passing back hard-coded. But if you want to get up and running on how do I build a web API, this quickly gets you going from there. I've only got about 2 minutes left. I want to talk briefly about cores. So probably the best way to cover that is to actually come back to my sample project here. So there's a number of ways to set up cores, which is cross-origin resource sharing. It's basically how do you call from one domain to another and not have the browser get upset that it thinks you're doing some sort of cross-site scripting attack or hacking of the site. You need to explain and set up permissions for that to happen. The way that works, there's a couple of things you need to do. First, you need to come into your NuGet package manager and actually install the cores package so you've got the components for that. And then if we come into my web API project, where are we here? In my app start, there's a WebAPI config file. There's a couple of different ways to do this. I've taken a fairly simple approach here, where basically what I do is I set up a CORS attribute that says, I'm only going to take requests from a particular URL, and I like putting that in the web config so it's easy to configure. But from a methods and a headers point of view, I'm going to accept all from there. So it's not completely wide open, but it's moderately wide open from that point of view. And then I enable CORS from there. And there's a couple of usings that I need to go in, and I need that NuGet package for all of this to get resolved. Once I've done that, that basically sets up my web API and it allows me to go from there. If I go over to my sample form, there's also this cross-domain true here that basically says make sure you make this a CORS compliant call so that it wires together on both sides. So that's basically it from there. We're pretty much out of time there, so I have to work on my pacing here. Let me come back to the deck. We're basically done on the deck. I mean, what I've got as a remaining item in here is a couple links to the SharePoint Framework slides from Ignite, a bit of detail around the patterns and practices side of things, where you'll find a lot of samples from a SharePoint Framework point of view, as well as a ton of other very valuable content in there as well. So have a look at that. The piece that I wanted to stress here, I mean, we didn't get as far as getting the code that I was showing you into a SharePoint Framework web part, but the tough part was getting the web API and the client-side code talking to each other. Once you've gotten there and you set up all your permissions and authentication with Azure AD, then dropping that into a SharePoint Framework web part is fairly straightforward. And once you know who that user is, you've got that piece of information. So if we come back to our web API for a minute here and look at our controller, just this simple line of code, being able to say who's calling me and know that that's secure and not hackable is incredibly important, because then I can use a service account, talk to SharePoint, talk to other line of business applications, and start to do all sorts of things that maybe that user is not allowed to do, but I need to know who they are, determine what they are allowed to do. So that's where we can start to bake those business rules into this web API layer, make sure that it's secure, it's not running in the browser, it's running back on an Azure website or on premises. So that's basically it there. Amanda, I don't know if there were particular questions that we want to call out quickly here.
Peter, we can address them offline. There were a couple of questions that we need to get back to.
Okay. So yeah, certainly what we can do is we'll be sending a follow-up email with the link and the recording. We'll have specific ones if there's specific questions to be answered back on there as well. And certainly open to having a one-on-one conversation if you want to go deeper from that perspective as well. So I want to thank everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And if you haven't had a chance to try out, when you get the links in the deck, there is a nice series on GitHub that takes you through the experience of building your Hello World web part. Have a look at that, look at what I've got, how you fit that together, and really start to build some very powerful applications on top of SharePoint Framework. So thank you very much, and we'll talk again. Bye now.